Every empire has promised its money would last forever. Every government has sworn that its currency was built on strength and stability, and every single time, history has proven them wrong. From ancient Rome to modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their life savings turned into paper with no meaning. The collapse of money isn't rare, it's the rule. The real question has never been if financial systems fail, but how you protect yourself when they do. We like to believe our money is solid, that what we see in our accounts represents something real, but money is not bedrock, it's trust, and trust can vanish overnight. That's why history is brutal and why it's so valuable to study. Every collapse leaves behind lessons, clues about what survives when money dies. Because the people who make it through aren't the ones who believe the loudest. They're the ones who doubted first. So let's start where trust in gold was supposed to be unbreakable, and watch how it all unraveled. When the Byzantine Empire began minting the purest gold coin in history, it created centuries of stability, until temptation won. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of Rome that outlived its western twin by 1,000 years. At the center of its strength was a single coin, the gold solidus. For centuries, it was trusted everywhere. Merchants from Europe to Asia accepted it without question. It was as good as gold itself. But power always tempts rulers to cheat. You'd think they would have learned from Rome's earlier disaster, when emperors kept mixing cheaper metals into their silver coins until they were worth almost nothing. Centuries later, the Byzantines made the same mistake, but in gold. They began shaving its purity, stretching it thinner, and diluting it with copper and silver. At first, nobody noticed. Then, trust cracked. The solidus that once anchored Mediterranean trade became just another political lie. When the gold was gone, so was the empire's credibility. The economy that had stood strong for centuries began to crumble. What survived wasn't government promises or imperial loyalty. It was the merchants who quietly hoarded real gold and land beyond the empire's reach. Their wealth outlived the empire itself. That's the first timeless lesson. Governments can never resist the temptation to dilute their money. And when they do, real value escapes into things they can't counterfeit. But not every collapse starts with greed. Sometimes it begins with something no one could have predicted, a shock that changes the world overnight. In the mid-14th century, Europe faced a disaster unlike anything before it. The Black Death swept through cities and villages, killing as many as half of all people within just a few years. Streets emptied, fields went silent, trade routes collapsed. It looked like the end of the world. But when half the population vanished, something strange happened. Labor became precious. Survivors could suddenly demand higher wages. Food and land, once scarce, became easy to get. Families with savings or goods found themselves in a new kind of power. Land that had cost a fortune could now be bought for almost nothing. Entire estates stood abandoned. The survivors were living in a buyer's market. And those who had even a small amount of liquidity, silver, goods, or useful skills, climbed the social ladder almost overnight. The poor became landowners. The humble became wealthy. History had flipped the world's balance in an instant. If that sounds familiar, it should. When the COVID pandemic hit centuries later, we saw the same pattern. Supply chains broke down. Governments printed trillions to keep economies from freezing. And just like in the 14th century, those with liquidity, cash, assets, or property took advantage of the chaos. Housing prices soared. Stock markets recovered fast. Meanwhile, ordinary families struggled to pay rent. Pandemics always redistribute wealth. They punish those living paycheck to paycheck and reward those prepared for crisis. It's an old pattern dressed in modern clothes. But even as Europe recovered, a new kind of collapse was waiting, not caused by disease, but by the failure of trust itself. Next up, Florence would learn that too big to fail was already a myth long before Wall Street. In the 1300s, Florence was the financial heart of Europe. Its grand families, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, ran powerful banks that financed kings and nations. They were the giants of their time. And like all giants, they believed they were untouchable. Their biggest client was King Edward III of England, a man who needed mountains of money to fund his wars against France. The Florentine bankers kept lending, confident he would always pay them back. Then Edward stopped paying. The moment he defaulted, everything collapsed. The mighty Bardi and Peruzzi banks fell overnight. Depositors were ruined, trade froze. And Florence, once Europe's financial capital, was thrown into chaos. Ordinary citizens who had trusted the city's biggest names lost everything. The lesson was harsh, but simple. Size is not safety. Reputation is not protection. Institutions exist to profit, not to guarantee your survival. And when they fall, they take your savings with them. That truth has echoed through every century since, from Florence to Lehman Brothers in 2008, to the banks of Lebanon freezing accounts in 2019. Too big to fail is not a promise. It's a comforting lie people tell themselves until it's too late. But money doesn't only die in boardrooms and banks. Sometimes it dies on the battlefield, drowned in the noise of gunfire and the printing press. Next, we move to America's own forgotten financial war. The American Civil War is remembered for its battles and its politics. But behind the soldiers and speeches, there was another war, a financial one. Both the Union and the Confederacy discovered that war on this scale needed money far beyond what they had. So they printed it. In the North, the government released a new paper currency called greenbacks. It wasn't backed by gold, only by the promise of the United States itself. At first, people accepted it with pride. It felt bold, patriotic, and necessary. But soon, the more greenbacks flooded into the economy, the less each one could buy. Inflation crept in like a quiet thief. Prices rose, trust faded, and what started as a symbol of unity became a sign of decay. In the South, things were far worse. The Confederacy printed greybacks by the wagon load to fund its war. By the end, those notes were worth almost nothing. Soldiers' pay couldn't buy food. Families carried bags of bills that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. By 1865, Confederate currency wasn't weak. It was dead. The people who survived weren't the ones holding patriotic paper. They were the ones who had something real: land, food, or gold. While others watched their life savings disappear, they held the only things that still mattered. The lesson is as brutal as it is timeless. When a nation's money dies, the survivors are the ones holding what the system can't print. And for America, this wasn't just history. It was a warning that would echo for centuries. Across the ocean, France was about to repeat the same mistake. Only this time, it wasn't war that killed its currency. It was revolution. In the 1790s, France was burning with revolution. The monarchy had fallen, the people had seized control. And to rebuild the nation, the new government made a promise: to create a fair and stable economy for all. Their solution was a new kind of paper money called the assignat. It was backed by the value of church lands the state had seized. In theory, it was brilliant. The people trusted it because it represented the revolution itself. But just like every government before them, France couldn't resist printing more. Each new issue diluted the last. Prices rose faster than wages. Soon, the assignat bought almost nothing. Farmers refused to sell their grain for paper. Markets demanded silver or goods instead. And hunger returned to the streets of Paris. The same people who had fought for freedom now stood in bread lines with worthless money in their hands. The government tried to blame speculators. They tried to fix prices. Nothing worked. By the time the chaos ended, the assignat had collapsed completely. What survived wasn't paper, but property. Not promises, but food and gold. Once again, the lesson was clear. Revolutions can change governments, but they can't change the laws of trust. When money loses credibility, no amount of ideology can save it. 2 centuries later, the same story would play out again. This time not in Europe, but across Asia. It began with a single country's currency collapse and ended with an entire region brought to its knees. In 1997, Thailand's economy was booming. Skyscrapers rose. Foreign investors poured in money. Everyone believed the good times would last forever. But beneath the surface, danger was building. Thailand had borrowed heavily in US dollars, trusting that its currency, the baht, would stay strong. Then the peg broke. The baht collapsed. And overnight, every dollar of foreign debt became impossible to repay. What began as a local panic turned into a regional disaster. Investors fled. Currencies across Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea, began to fall one after another. Businesses went bankrupt. Jobs disappeared. Entire economies shrank almost overnight. The people who suffered the most weren't the ones who had caused the crisis. It was ordinary citizens whose savings evaporated while the global hedge funds that triggered the collapse walked away richer. Families watched their mortgages double in cost. Middle-class dreams were wiped out in months. And yet, the pattern was painfully familiar. Those who held dollars or assets abroad survived far better than those who trusted their local currency. Nations tied to foreign debt were forced into austerity, while Wall Street investors bought Asian companies at fire sale prices. It wasn't just an economic collapse, it was a global transfer of wealth. The lesson was unmistakable. Debt in someone else's money is a death trap. When the storm hits, it's not the creditor who sinks, it's the debtor. And even after centuries of proof, people still believe their banks, their governments, and their money are safe. But in 2019, one small nation reminded the world how quickly that illusion can shatter. In 2019, the people of Lebanon woke up to find their world had changed overnight. The banks, the same ones that had promised stability and safety, had locked their doors. Withdrawals were frozen, transfers were blocked, and the national currency began to crumble. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value. Doctors, engineers, teachers, and families lined up outside the banks, begging to access their own money. But the banks refused. Decades of savings turned into dust. People watched their life's work disappear while the system that had sworn to protect them simply shut down. It wasn't just the poor who suffered. It was the middle class, the professionals, the retirees, anyone who trusted the system. And the harsh truth became impossible to ignore. Your money in the bank isn't a treasure chest. It's a loan you've given to an institution that can decide not to pay you back. Those who survived weren't the ones who trusted the banks. They were the ones who moved early, the ones who had property, gold, or foreign assets beyond the government's reach. Everyone else was trapped. If that sounds distant, it shouldn't. In 2008, Americans watched their homes repossessed while the same banks that caused the crash were bailed out. In 2020, trillions were printed to keep the economy alive, inflating asset prices for the wealthy and leaving wages behind. In 2023, small U.S. banks collapsed overnight when depositors lost confidence. The pattern never changed. Too big to fail remained the same old myth. And once again, history repeated its warning. Money is only safe until the moment it isn't. So what actually survives when paper, banks, and trust all fall apart? The answer has never changed, though most people never notice it until it's too late. Every collapse leaves behind the same footprints. Paper money burns. Promises break. But something always survives. In Byzantium, it was gold. After the Black Death, it was liquidity, the ability to buy abandoned land when others had nothing. In Florence, it was the refusal to trust too big to fail. In the Confederacy, it was real goods and farmland. In France, it was food and property. In Asia, it was staying away from debt in foreign currency. And in Lebanon, it was getting out of the banks before they shut their doors. The pattern is clear. Survival doesn't come from faith in paper or institutions. It comes from recognizing what has real value before everyone else does. But here's the paradox. Collapse is both tragedy and opportunity. For the unprepared, it destroys everything. For the alert, it opens doors that are normally locked. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners because there was too much land and not enough people. After 2008, those with cash bought homes and businesses while millions were foreclosed. Every crisis transfers wealth from those who trust to those who prepare. But true wealth isn't only what you own, it's what you can do. The survivors of history weren't just hoarders of gold or land. They were builders, creators, and producers. The baker who could still make bread, the craftsman who could repair tools, the farmer who could feed a community, the merchant who could move goods when borders closed. These were the people who didn't just survive collapse, they rose in it. Because when money loses meaning, production doesn't. People still need to eat, to build, to trade, and to live. Those who can meet those needs never stay poor for long. That's the deeper protection. Not blind faith in systems, not the hope that banks or governments will save you, but the combination of real assets, real skills, and awareness. Every collapse is a transfer, from paper promises to tangible value, from passive savers to active builders, from the many who trust to the few who prepare. So the question isn't whether everything will fall apart. It always does. The question is whether you'll be holding paper when it happens, or something real. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes loudly enough to warn anyone willing to listen. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has already shown what survives. Now you know where to look.